The last thing I expected to find in the woodpile was my recipe for lemon meringue pie, tucked inside the warped cover of my Betty Crocker cookbook. The page was stiff, stained with something dark, and the corner was torn away. A low, wet breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sweet like old pennies and forgotten fruit. Not a single bird sang. The world seemed to be holding its breath. I held the ruined page in my hand, the rough, damp bark of the logs pressing into my knees, the cold of the sodden ground already seeping through the fabric of my slacks. It was a deep cold, a wet cold that did not stop at the skin but soaked straight through to the muscle, making the very marrow of my bones feel like ice. A cold shudder traced its way down my spine, a feeling like a cellar door opening somewhere deep inside me, releasing a puff of musty, unbreathable air. The cookbook itself was a terrible sight. The cheerful red cover was swollen and distorted, the cardboard layers separating like cheap pastry. The corners were soft and black with mildew. It had not looked like this the last time I saw it. It smelled of the grave, of wet leaves and decay and time. It was an artifact from a place I did not want to recognize. Before the woodpile, before the silence that fell over the house next door, before the cold had a name, there was a Tuesday. It had all started 6 months ago. On a Tuesday. But before the day began, there was the night. I sat in the armchair in the corner of the living room, the one with the springs that had given up years ago. My hands rested in my lap, palms up, the skin of them loose and mapped with veins. They did not move. I watched them as if they belonged to someone else. The house was utterly silent, a thick, plush silence that absorbed all noise. Not even the refrigerator hummed. The air was cool and tasted of dust and the faint, lingering scent of Raymond's pipe tobacco, a ghost of a smell from a habit he had given up a decade ago. It was the space between heartbeats, the pause at the top of a breath. It was the stillness of waiting for something you could not name. The first sound was the tired groan of the floorboards in the hall as Raymond made his way to the bathroom. My whole body tensed at the noise, a string pulled taut, my shoulders hunching up toward my ears before I forced them down. Then came the hiss and clank of the pipes, a sound like the house clearing its throat. The air in our bedroom was cool, carrying the faint, sweet smell of the last of the season's roses from the garden outside, their scent thick and almost cloying as they began to die on the vine. This was mingled with the sharper, earthy scent of yesterday's rain clinging to the window screens, a smell like fresh soil and worms. The coolness in the air was a living thing, a presence that settled on my bare arms and the tip of my nose, making my skin feel tight. I lay still for a moment, listening to the house wake up around me, my breath held tight in my chest. A low hum, hesitant at first, finally came from the refrigerator downstairs. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed the half hour with a weary, metallic bong that vibrated through the floor and up into the bed frame. I smoothed the worn fabric of my nightgown, the cotton thin as a prayer against my skin, my fingers tracing the seams over and over. Down in the kitchen, the room was warm. I'd left the pilot light of the oven on overnight, a habit from my girlhood that my mother had called wasteful, but that I called comfort. It filled the space with a dry, constant heat that kept the morning chill at bay, a warmth that wrapped around me like a wool shawl. On the stove, the kettle was already beginning to whisper, a soft, conspiratorial sound. I moved through the familiar space, my bare feet silent on the linoleum. The smell of coffee grounds, rich and dark, rose from the can as I opened it. It mingled with the faint, lingering scent of the fried chicken from last night's supper, a greasy, comforting ghost. My starched apron hung on its hook by the pantry, and I took it down, tying the strings in a crisp bow at the small of my back. The fabric was stiff, smelling of soap and sunshine and the hot metal of the iron. I ran my palms over it, a continuous, soothing motion, the crisp cotton, a shield against the day. Then I saw them. By the back door, just where he always left them. Raymond's work boots. They were caked in mud, great clods of dark, wet earth clinging to the soles and splattered up the thick leather sides. A small puddle of murky water was already forming on the floor I had just mopped the night before. The water smelled stagnant and sour, like a ditch. The cold from the puddle seemed to radiate outwards, a stark contrast to the oven's warmth. A familiar heat pricked at the back of my neck, a sharp, angry needle point. I took a breath, the air thick with the competing smells of damp earth and brewing coffee. The clock in the hall ticked, a loud, judgmental sound in the suddenly quiet room. The kettle began to whistle, its whisper escalating to a high, thin scream that made my teeth ache. My hands clenched at my sides, my fingernails digging into my palms. I turned away from the boots, my hands finding my apron again, smoothing. On the small kitchen table next to the sugar bowl sat the salt shaker, a little ceramic pear with a chip in its green glaze. The chip was shaped like a tiny crescent moon. It had been there for as long as I could remember. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. I began to make the coffee. The first incident was the sugar bowl. I came downstairs one morning, the air thick with the promise of a humid August day, a blanket of heat that had yet to fall. The kitchen hummed with the sound of a large fly buzzing angrily against the window pane, a frantic, trapped noise that seemed to get inside my head. I went to make Raymond's coffee. He liked it sweet, 2 heaping spoonfuls. I reached for the sugar bowl on the table, my hand closing around empty air. It wasn't there. My fingers twitched, confused. It sat on the counter by the sink, a good 10 feet from its usual spot. I stood there for a long moment, the empty sugar spoon in my hand, cold against my palm. The air by the counter smelled of toast and the faint chemical scent of the fly spray I'd used earlier. The linoleum was cold under my feet here, away from the oven's embrace, a cold that bit at the soles of my feet. My first thought was that Raymond had moved it, but that made no sense. Why would he? He never prepared his own coffee, never so much as rinsed a cup. I called out to him, my voice sounding tight and strange. He was in the living room, hidden behind the rustling fortress of his newspaper. "Did you move the sugar bowl?" His voice came back, muffled and impatient. "Move what, hon?" I explained, pointing with the spoon at the empty space on the table, then to the counter. He just grunted, a sound of dismissal. "Must have been you, Ev. I didn't touch it." And that was the second thought, the one that landed with a dull thud of certainty. It had to be me, but I could not recall doing it. I replayed the previous evening in my mind, clearing the plates, wiping the table, the familiar 1, 2, 3 motion of placing the salt, pepper, and sugar in the center. The memory was clear, crisp. To doubt it felt like doubting the sun would rise. So what was the alternative? That the bowl had moved itself? The thought was so absurd, so childish, that a small, nervous tremor started in my hand. It was the kind of foolishness that led to locked rooms and quiet, hushed visits. No, that was impossible. The simplest answer was the correct one. I had been more tired than I realized. I had carried it to the counter with the dirty dishes and simply forgotten. My memory was getting a little porous around the edges. I was 67 after all. These things happened. It was a sign of age, not madness. I took a long, slow breath, and the tension in my shoulders eased. Of course! It was just forgetfulness! I walked over to the counter, my bare feet padding on the cool floor, and picked up the sugar bowl. It felt solid and real in my hands. I carried it back to the table and set it down in its rightful place, its little glass lid clinking softly against the base. The sound was reassuring, normal. The fly finally quieted. The sun, climbing higher in the sky, streamed through the window, and a warm patch of light fell across my hands on the table. The warmth felt good. I made Raymond's coffee, spooning in the sugar, and the simple domestic ritual was enough to push the last of the unease away. Everything was fine. Between the sugar bowl and the cookbook, there was a stillness. A Sunday afternoon, heavy and silent. Raymond was asleep in his chair, a newspaper draped over his face, rising and falling with each soft snore. I sat at the kitchen table, not reading, not sewing, just sitting. My hands were in my lap, one cupping the other, feeling the warmth of my own skin. The only sound was the clock and the drowsy buzz of a bumblebee bumping against the screen of the open window. The air tasted metallic and green, the scent of the freshly cut grass so thick you could almost chew it. I stared at the salt shaker on the table, the little ceramic pear. I watched how the light from the window caught its glazed surface, how the shadow it cast seemed to grow longer and thinner as the afternoon wore on. I did nothing, and nothing happened. The world held its breath, and for a while I held mine with it. The second time, it was my cookbook. My mother's Betty Crocker, the red one with the spine held together by yellowed, cracking tape. I was going to make a pork roast, the one with the apple and onion stuffing Raymond liked so much, the one that made the whole house smell of autumn. I went to the shelf next to the pantry where it always sat, nestled between a Good Housekeeping collection from 1972 and a thin volume of church potluck recipes. The space was empty. A fine layer of dust outlined the rectangle where it should have been. My hand, reaching for the familiar spine, stopped in mid-air. A cold prickle, sharp as tiny needles, went over my arms and down my back. The kitchen was warm, the oven already preheating and puffing out waves of dry heat, but I felt a sudden, intense chill, as if a window had been opened directly behind me, letting in a draft of cellar air. The room smelled the faint hiss of gas from the oven and the sharp, clean scent of the dish soap I used on the breakfast dishes, a scent that now seemed thin and chemical. My body went rigid, my breath caught in my throat. I began to search. At first, calmly, then with a rising sense of panic that made my hands shake. I looked on the countertops, behind the flour canisters, in the drawers, even in the living room, thinking I might have carried it in there for some reason. It was nowhere. It had vanished. When Raymond came home, his boots leaving their daily tribute of mud and grass by the door, a fresh wave of damp, earthy smell filling the entryway, I asked him. He just shook his head, his face tired and creased with annoyance. "Evelyn, I don't know where your book is. Why would I move a cookbook?" And he was right. The question was absurd. It made no sense. So I began the process, the laborious mental gymnastics of finding a reason. My first thought, a sharp and bitter one, was that he had thrown it out. Maybe he was tired of the pork roast. Maybe it was some petty act of cruelty, but that wasn't right. Raymond was thoughtless, not cruel. He lacked the imagination for that kind of targeted malice. My next thought was that I had lent it to Mary, my neighbor. It was possible. We swapped recipes sometimes. I walked over to her house, my footsteps heavy on the pavement, but she hadn't seen it. She promised to look for her own copy of the recipe for me. Her kindness, a small, painful twist in my gut. I walked back home, the failure stinging my eyes. So what was left? I must have misplaced it. It was the only answer that did not involve a thief or a ghost. I had probably put it in a safe place, and now the location was so safe even I couldn't find it. It was frustrating, deeply so, but it wasn't sinister. It was just a sign of a mind getting cluttered with too many years of recipes and grocery lists and worries. A mind that was starting to overflow. I gave up on the pork roast and made Salisbury steak from a box instead. The smell of the artificial gravy was thick and unpleasant. The kitchen felt too hot, almost suffocating. The warmth from the oven no longer a comfort but an oppression. But then, as we ate in the living room watching television, Raymond reached over and patted my knee. "This is good, Ev," he said, his mouth full. "Real good." It was a small, simple kindness, but it felt like a lifeline. The tight knot in my chest loosened. After dinner, he helped me with the dishes, not because I asked, but just because. He splashed water everywhere, and I had to re-wash 2 of the forks, but the sight of him standing there, his big hands clumsy with the dish towel, filled the kitchen with a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. We were all right. I was all right. The book would turn up. Before the little pair made its journey, there was a Wednesday morning. Rain fell in a steady, determined drizzle, blurring the world outside the windows into a watercolor of greens and grays. The house was quiet. Raymond had left early. I sat at the kitchen table, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold in my hands. I watched the water droplets race each other down the glass pane. The air in the room was humid, and it tasted of rain and damp screens. My hands were still, resting on the smooth wood of the tabletop. I flexed my fingers one by one, watching the skin pull taut over the knuckles. I focused on the sound of the rain, the soft drumming on the roof, the gentle hiss against the windows. It was a cleansing sound, a sound that washed the world clean. For a long time, that was the only sound that mattered. Then came the salt shaker. One Saturday, I was dusting the living room. The air was still and thick with the scent of lemon polish and old paper from the stacks of National Geographics. The house was quiet, wrapped in the heavy blanket of a weekend afternoon. Raymond was out at the hardware store. I was running my dust cloth over the mantelpiece, a slow, methodical motion when I saw it. Tucked behind a framed photograph of our daughter, a picture from her wedding day. The little ceramic pear, its green glaze winking in a stray beam of light. My breath caught in my throat so sharply it was almost a sob. I froze, the dust cloth held aloft. My body went cold, a wave of chill washing over me from head to toe, leaving goose flesh in its wake. The smell of lemon polish was suddenly sickening. I picked it up. It felt cool and smooth in my hand, heavier than I remembered. It belonged in the kitchen, on the table. It had been there this morning when I made breakfast. I was sure of it. I had used it on my eggs. It had to be a joke. That was my first thought. Raymond, he'd come home for lunch, moved it to be funny. It was the sort of simple, foolish thing he might do. Move something, watch me look for it, then have a little laugh when he revealed its hiding place. It was his brand of humor. But as I stood there, the shaker clutched in my palm, it didn't feel funny. A cold, hard knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The joke felt mean, unsettling. It felt designed to make me question my own mind. And why this object? The little pear, so small and specific. No, it wasn't him. So then, what? I walked back to the kitchen, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silent house. The room was just as I'd left it. The sun streamed through the window over the sink, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. A low hum came from the refrigerator. Nothing was out of place except for the missing shaker. This led to the only other possibility. I had carried it in there myself. I must have. I was tidying up, my mind elsewhere, preoccupied with the grocery list or the mending pile. I picked it up with a handful of other knickknacks from the end table and set it down on the mantelpiece without thinking. Yes, that was it. That was much more likely than a cruel joke. It was a simple, logical explanation for a simple, illogical event. My mind was just wandering. I let out a breath. I didn't realize I'd been holding the air leaving my lungs in a shaky rush. A simple mistake. My own reasoning began to warm me like a blanket fresh from the dryer. I placed the shaker back on the table, its ceramic base making a soft, definitive click against the wood. I stood there for a moment, just looking at it. It looked so ordinary, so innocent. I ran my hand over the smooth, warm wood of the table, feeling the grain. I went to the oven and leaned my head against it for a moment, letting the gentle heat from the pilot light soak into my forehead. Everything was explainable. I was not losing my mind. I was just a woman of a certain age in an old house with a mind full of memories. That was all. The days between the salt shaker and the sound were still. I sat on the back porch swing, not swinging, just letting my feet rest on the painted wood. My hands lay in the lap of my apron, fingers loosely intertwined. The air was warm and smelled of cut grass and the sweet, cloying perfume of the honeysuckle climbing the trellis. It tasted like sunshine. In the quiet, I could hear the rustle of a squirrel in the oak tree, the distant drone of a lawnmower 2 streets over, the soft creak of the porch swing's chains as my weight settled. I was a statue in a garden of quiet sounds. I was waiting, though I did not know for what. The fourth incident was a sound, a scraping. It came from the back door. Late at night, I was in bed, hovering in that thin, fragile space between sleep and waking. The house was dark and silent. Raymond was snoring softly beside me, a rhythmic, comforting rumble that usually lulled me to sleep. Then I heard it. A faint shit. My eyes snapped open, wide in the darkness. My heart gave a single, painful thud against my ribs. The air in the room was cold, much colder than it should have been. A damp, penetrating cold that clung to the sheets. It carried the smell of an approaching storm, a damp, metallic scent like wet pennies. I lay perfectly still, my body rigid, my ears straining in the darkness, every muscle screaming. The sound stopped. The only noise was the frantic, loud ticking of the clock downstairs and Raymond's steady, oblivious breathing. My own breath was a silent scream in my throat. It was a tree branch. It had to be. The wind was picking up. I could hear it starting to whisper around the eaves of the house. A branch from the old maple was probably scraping against the kitchen window. That was the first, most logical explanation. But the sound hadn't come from the window. It had come from the floor. It was low, grounded. So, an animal then. A raccoon trying to get into the garbage cans right outside the back door, dragging the can. But the sound was inside. I was sure of it. The acoustics were wrong for an outside noise. It had the clipped, close sound of a noise made in a small room. The thought made my skin crawl. What then? I thought of Raymond's boots sitting by that same back door. The sound had come from there. The image of them, caked in mud, flashed in my mind. The next morning, Raymond found me on my hands and knees, my cheek pressed to the floor. "What in the world are you doing, Evelyn?" I pointed to a long, faint scratch on the linoleum, starting near where the boots sat and ending near the pantry. It was new, I was sure of it. He squinted, then nudged it with his socked foot. "It's a scratch, hon. It's an old house. The floor is covered in them. Probably did it myself, dragging in firewood." And there it was, the final plausible explanation. It made sense. Of course it did. He was clumsy. Firewood was heavy. I spent the morning scrubbing the kitchen floor. The act of cleaning was a comfort, a way to restore order. I pushed the mop back and forth, the familiar motion soothing my frayed nerves. The sharp, clean scent of pine cleaner filled the air, chasing away the lingering phantom smell of storm and mud. The linoleum gleamed under my efforts. The scratch was still there, but it seemed less menacing now, just one of many small imperfections in an old and well-loved home. The sun came out, and the kitchen was filled with warm, bright light. The cold from the bedroom was gone. It had all been a dream, a trick of the wind and an overactive imagination. Before the plate, there was a moment of peace. I sat in the dining room polishing my mother's silver. The pieces were spread out on a soft cloth on the heavy mahogany table. The room was cool and quiet, the air smelling of old wood and the waxy scent of the polish. My hands moved with a practiced, steady rhythm, rubbing the tarnish from a gravy boat, a sugar spoon, a set of pickle forks. My fingers, stained gray with polish, were careful and sure. The house was silent around me, a deep, restful quiet. The only sound was the soft rub of the cloth against metal. The taste of the air was nothing at all. It was just air. It was a moment of pure, uninterrupted stillness. The fifth incident was a broken plate. I kept my mother's good china on a display dresser in the dining room. One Monday, I went to dust it, and I saw that one of the dessert plates on the top shelf had a clean crack running right through the middle of it. It was still in its place, held together by sheer gravity and the pressure of the plate above it. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a small gasp. Those plates had been a wedding gift 48 years ago. I hadn't touched them in months. The air in the dining room was still and cool, smelling of the lemon potpourri I kept in a bowl on the sideboard. The only sound was the muffled whir of the dishwasher from the kitchen, a distant domestic hum. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I carefully lifted the two halves of the plate. The break was clean, sharp. It looked recent. My first thought was a tremor in the house, a heavy truck on the road. We lived on a quiet street, but it was possible. But the crack was too clean for a jolt. It wasn't shattered, it was sliced. My mind recoiled from the word. Then perhaps it was a flaw, a weakness in the china itself, a stress fracture that had finally, after 40 years, given way. That seemed scientific, plausible. When I showed the pieces to Raymond that evening, his face hardened. Well, I didn't do it. The familiar heat of defensiveness rose in my chest. I wanted to scream at him, but my voice came out small and tight. "I'm not saying you did, Raymond." Later that night, as I lay in the dark, I constructed the final, necessary explanation. It was a combination of things. A structural flaw, the house settling, a vibration from a passing truck at the exact right frequency. It was all possible. Each incident on its own was a small, explainable thing, a moment of forgetfulness, an old house making noises, a clumsy husband. A simple accident. but when I lined them all up in my mind, they formed a pattern, a string of pearls, each one cold and heavy and undeniable. I felt a tremor in my hands and tucked them under the covers, almost convinced, almost safe in the belief that I was imagining it all. I finally broke my silence with Mary. She was in her yard, on her knees in the dirt, tending to her hydrangeas. The air smelled of turned earth, the sweet, heady perfume of the flowers, and the faint, dusty scent of the burlap sack she used for weeds. A bee droned lazily past my ear. I went over, my basket of laundry on my hip, the clothespins clacking, and just started talking. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, a torrent of sugar bowls and cookbooks and scraping sounds and broken plates. She listened, her trowel resting in the rich, dark soil, her brow furrowed with concern. When I finished, a profound sense of relief washed over me, a warmth spreading through my chest, chasing away the chill that had taken up residence there for weeks. My hands, which had been twisting the fabric of my apron into a knot, finally stilled and fell to my sides. Mary looked over at my house, her gaze lingering on the kitchen window. "That's strange, Evelyn," she said, her voice low and serious. "Just the other night, I was woken up by a noise. Raymond was at his bowling league, I think, because his truck was gone." I looked out my window, and I saw your kitchen light on. Then I heard something, a crash, like glass breaking. A jolt went through me, sharp and electric. It was the night the plate had broken. It was the night the plate had broken. My breath hitched in my throat. "You heard it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "I almost called you, but then the light went out and I figured you'd just dropped a glass or something. I didn't want to bother you." It wasn't my imagination. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. The world swam for a moment. Someone else saw it. Someone else heard it. I wasn't going crazy. The warmth in my chest bloomed, hot and fierce. I was sane. I spoke with her 2 more times that week. The conversations were always short, stolen over the fence while we were hanging laundry, the scent of wet cotton and soap in the air between us. She told me she thought she saw a shadow moving past my living room window one evening when she knew I was at my church circle. I felt a fresh wave of validation, but this time it was mixed with something else. A cold dread that seeped into the warmth. If it wasn't me and it wasn't Raymond, then what was in my house? Mary suggested I have the locks checked. "You can't be too careful, Evelyn." Her voice was a comfort, a steady anchor in the churning sea of my thoughts. She was my witness, my proof. Then she was gone. But next Monday, I went to take her a slice of the apple pie I'd baked. Her house was silent. The curtains, usually open to the morning sun, were drawn tight. I knocked, the sound echoing flatly in the still air. There was no answer. The air was cool and smelled of impending rain. A dog barked somewhere down the street, a lonely, persistent sound. I tried the phone later that afternoon. It rang and rang, a shrill, unanswered summons in an empty house. The ringing drilled into my ear, each new buzz a fresh wave of anxiety. I tried again the next day and the day after that. Each time, the result was the same. The line was not disconnected. It just rang into a void of silence. I told myself she'd gone on a trip. Her sister lived in Kentucky. She probably decided to visit her last minute. It was a perfectly logical explanation. But as the days turned into a week, a knot of ice formed in the pit of my stomach. Her car was still in the driveway. Her newspaper from 3 days ago was still sitting on her porch, swollen and pulpy with rain, the black ink bleeding into gray rivers. The smell of it, wet and sour, reached me even from my own yard. I stopped calling. The silence on the other end of the line was worse than the ringing. My world began to shrink. It was just me and the house now. Raymond had grown tired of my talk about misplaced things and strange noises. "For heaven's sake, Evelyn, you're letting your imagination run away with you," he'd said one night, his voice sharp with an impatience that felt like a slap. After that, I stopped talking about it, but the silence didn't make it go away. It only made it louder inside my own head. My routines, once a source of comfort, became a source of terror. I would clean the kitchen, my heart pounding in my ears, my eyes scanning for the next thing to be out of place. The smell of lemon polish felt cloying. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like a low, predatory growl. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a stage, and I was waiting in the wings for a cue I didn't understand. I stopped baking. The joy was gone, replaced by a constant, low-level hum of dread. Dust began to gather on the cookbook shelf where my mother's Betty Crocker should have been. I found myself sitting in the kitchen for hours, just watching, listening. My apron felt heavy, the strings digging into the small of my back. I would smooth the fabric, back and forth, my thumb rubbing a hole in the worn cotton, but the motion brought no comfort. My hands trembled constantly. My sleep was thin and broken, a gray, restless state. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window pane sent a jolt of pure ice through my veins. The cold spot by the back door grew larger and colder. It was a tangible presence now, a pocket of deep, unnatural chill that the oven's constant warmth could not touch. I would walk past it, and the skin on my arms would pebble and ache. The cold did not just touch the skin, it sank into my muscles, making my joints stiff and sore. It felt like it was trying to get into my bones. I checked the weather stripping around the door. It was intact. I checked the window. It was locked tight. One afternoon, I knelt and put my hand flat on the linoleum. It felt like a block of ice. Raymond, coming in from the yard, nearly tripped over me. "What are you doing now?" he asked, his voice weary. I told him about the cold. He rolled his eyes, a gesture that made something inside me shrivel. "It's an old house, Evelyn. There are drafts." He stepped right through the spot with his muddy boots, leaving a fresh trail of dark, wet earth, and the cold seemed to cling to his footprints, making them glisten. I started putting a thick braided rug over the spot, but it didn't help. The chill just seeped right through it, cold and damp and constant. The night it ended, the rain was coming down in sheets. It was a real Ohio thunderstorm, the kind that rattles your teeth and makes you feel small. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a hungry animal, and the windows trembled in their frames. Raymond was gone for the night, a union meeting over in Cincinnati. He wouldn't be back until morning. The house felt vast and empty and loud. The only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic, galloping ticking of the clock in the hall. The air was thick and cold. The small, constant heat from the oven pilot seemed to have finally given up, extinguished by the damp. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea that I couldn't bring myself to drink. And then I saw them. The boots. He had forgotten to take them to be resoled. They sat by the back door, dripping water and mud onto the braided rug I had laid down. In the dim light from the single bulb over the sink, they looked long, malevolent. Their shape was twisted, almost predatory. The mud that caked them was black, not brown, and it seemed to cling to them with a purpose. All the frustration, all the fear, all the simmering resentment of the past months coalesced into a single point of cold, clear fury. The boots. It always came back to the boots, that small daily act of disrespect, that constant dirtying presence in my clean space. A strange, preternatural calm settled over me. The trembling in my hands stopped. I stood up, my chair scraping softly on the floor. I was not going to be afraid anymore. I was going to move the boots. I was going to put them outside, in the storm where they belonged. I walked across the kitchen floor. The cold spot was gone. The whole room was cold now, a deep, uniform chill. My bare feet made no sound on the linoleum. I reached the back door. The wind hammered against it, and a spray of cold water shot through a crack in the frame, spattering my face. I bent down. My hand closed around the wet, cold leather of the first boot. It was heavy, much heavier than it should have been, weighted with more than just mud and water. I lifted it. Something inside shifted. With a soft, rattling clatter, an object fell out. It landed on the rug with a muffled thud. I stared at it. It was the salt shaker. The little ceramic pear, its chipped glaze looked black. It was caked in dried mud, and something else, something dark. A piece of fabric was snagged on its stem, a small piece of blue, floral fabric. The same pattern as Mary's favorite dress, the one she wore in her garden. My breath left me in a rush. I looked from the shaker to the boot. I looked at my own hands. They were covered in dried mud, dark, rich soil, the same soil on the shaker. A sound escaped my throat. It was thin, a wounded noise. I backed away from the door. My gaze fixed on the horrifying little scene. The wind shrieked against the house. The lights flickered and died. Then they flickered on again. Stark, flashing images, the muddy shaker, the blue fabric, my own filthy hands. I turned. I looked at the cookbook shelf. It was no longer empty. The Betty Crocker was there. It was in its place. I had never lost my cookbook. My gaze fell upon the dining room. From the doorway, I could see the plate. The dessert plate was whole. The house was not breaking. The world was not breaking. I was. The scraping sound was not a branch. It was me dragging Mary's trowel, dragging it across my floor. The cold was not a draft. The cold came from me. All the things I had tidied away, explained away, smoothed over like my apron. Raymond never left his boots by the door. He always took them off on the porch. I was the one. I brought them inside. I needed them there. I needed a place to put the anger. I looked at the dark thing on the floor. The little pear filled with dirt, filled with secrets. It was not a monster from outside. It was a monster from inside. My hands were so cold. The cold went to the bone.